And international affairs analyst Bola Adediran joins me from the UK to discuss the international condemnation of Russia over allegations of civilian bodies in the streets of Bucha. Good to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
It does seem as though we are now beginning to see the full extent of this war, especially how things have been playing out in terms of civilian casualties. Russia has denied this latest bodies found in Bucha. But what do you make of this?
I think this is, as you've rightly said, this is the very unfortunate consequence of war. We should not be really surprised about this, that as atrocities have been uncovered in places like Bucha, but atrocities happen in war. And there have been indications. I think the ICC, as far back as 2 or 3 weeks ago, decided to open investigations in Ukraine. And that was partly because it had deemed that war crimes or crimes against humanity were happening in Ukraine. So I am not completely surprised about this new discovery. Of course, the state of the bodies and what particularly could have transpired in Bucha are very concerning. Individuals, civilians, apparently bound and shot, sometimes in the head, and executed. And obviously, these are very sad occurrences. But the reality of it, and everyone who has been looking at this conflict would also agree, is that atrocities would always occur in war because tensions are high. Individuals have lost family, soldiers have lost colleagues, and inevitably they always resort to actions like this. But I think what is also very important, obviously, is the international condemnation against against Russia. As the investigations begin, we need to get to the full extent of Russia's participation in these war crimes.
And the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, is now calling for more sanctions against Russia. But this is coming just after the Prime Minister of Poland did accuse Germany of being the major roadblock to tougher sanctions on Russia. Do you think that there's a way to go around this? How can the West sanction Russia for these atrocities?
Well, sanctions have... depending on which analyst you speak to, they will tell you that sanctions will not stop Russia from engaging in the kind of aggressive actions that it's been engaging in. Obviously, as I've mentioned severally on this platform before, sanctions may not deter Russia because it considers Ukraine as a vital security interest. But what sanctions obviously does is to increase the cost of war for Russia and to signal to Russia that its actions are not acceptable under any conditions. Now, for this particular atrocity that has happened in Bucha, what I think is more appropriate, not necessarily ask sanctions, but looking at the way international tribunals or international criminal court can bring these can investigate this particular atrocity and look at how we can bring those who have committed atrocities to book. Now, that's always going to be difficult, but we've over the years accepted concepts and doctrines like the responsibility to protect. And this is where we have to put words into action and ensure that those concepts, those doctrines, those norms that the international community have agreed to, like the idea of responsibility to protect, now should be put into proper action. So those are the things I am trying to see. We've also seen the suggestion by former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gordon Brown, and one of our own professors, Professor Dapo Akonde of Oxford University, suggest the creation of an special international tribunal on Ukraine. Those are the kind of actions that I think would have more effect than sanctions to bring justice for the victims of this war.
And how does that play out? We saw the case at the ICC against Rohingya, the military in Myanmar, accusing them of genocide and war crimes against the Rohingya people, and we saw how that played out. So how does this work if this tribunal is set up, and or maybe the ICC, their cases or petition to the ICC? Yeah. How does this work?
Well, let's be clear that justice doesn't happen overnight. It might take years. In the case of Serbia, for instance, former Serbian leaders, it took several years for the eventual prosecution of Serbian leaders who had committed atrocities in the 90s, for that to come to fruition. So this might take years, but the long arms of justice will finally catch up with those who have committed atrocities. But in the case of the ICC has already opened up investigations, and it's collecting the evidence that it needs. When it deems that, when the special prosecutor, Mr. Karik Kam, has found that indeed atrocities have been committed and he has the evidence, then when he can name the individuals who have committed those atrocities, then they will begin to take proper steps into bringing that about. In terms of the International Special Tribunal that has been suggested by Gordon Brown, well, it's also probably going to work in that same similar way, which is about first investigations, identifying the perpetrators, then looking at how to work with international collaborators to find those who have committed those atrocities and bring them to account. Obviously, it's going to be difficult because in this case, Russia will probably be protecting. Don't forget that a couple of years ago when the same Salisbury poisoning happened, where Russian agents used chemical agents in the streets of UK. Those special operatives that engaged in that dastardly act were protected by Russia. So I expect that Russia will continue to protect perpetrators of this injustice. But that doesn't mean that the international community should not try and continue to power pressure on Russia to do the right thing.
Exactly my point, and I think you got to the fact or the point I was trying to make when I said how does this work? Because you would need people to testify. You would need Russians who were involved in this war to testify in that tribunal. It is one thing to ask them to come testify; it's another thing to get them to testify actually. So that's why I was asking you, how does this work? But let's turn to Russia now, where President Putin has now asked those threatened rather to stop supplying gas to Europe if they refuse to pay in rubles, and that's just an attempt to boost the ruble because of it has taken a downward turn. But do you think that Russia now has the capacity to, on one hand, fight a military war in Ukraine, and on the other, create a military or begin an economic war with Europe?
Well, it's a lot of blustering from Russia because on one hand, Europe needs Russian gas to heat up the homes, and we depend on Russian gas here in the UK, at least in some respect, to be able to heat up our homes and not freeze to death. But more importantly, obviously, is that, as you've rightly mentioned, Russia also has this enormous sanctions that has been placed on it. And so it realizes that it's fighting. There is a financial cost of going to war, obviously, and all the sanctions are also impacting its economy. So I wonder whether this is a lot of blustering from Russia, saying that on one hand, customers and clients have to pay in ruble. But immediately he said that, he gave them the deadline. That deadline passed, and it was willing to extend that deadline. So I don't know what is going to come out of this. I don't know whether European countries are going to acquiesce and accept Russia's demands on this. But more importantly, obviously, is that Russia is also trying to find a way to stave off the full effect of these sanctions. Is deepening relationship with places like India. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, was in India last week, trying to cozy up to the Indians and the Pakistanis and look for other ways and also speaking to the Chinese, looking for other ways to ensure that the sanctions don't fully bite and destroy its economy. So these are all attempts by Russia to ensure that its economy does not fully tank. But obviously, we're seeing the impact of the sanctions on Russia, and it's beginning to tell on its economy clearly.
We'll continue to monitor this situation on all sides. Thank you so much for talking to us, International Affairs Analyst Dr. Bola Adediran.
Thank you.